Close your eyes for a second. Actually, don't. You're watching a video, but imagine this. You are born into royalty. Your entire species exists functionally to serve you. There are tens of thousands of workers whose sole biological purpose revolves around your needs. You are fed, groomed, protected. You are, by any definition, the most important individual in an entire civilization. You are the queen. Sounds incredible, right? Now here's the rest of it. You will spend the first chapter of your life flying, not gracefully, not triumphantly, but desperately, in a chaotic swarm with thousands of other potential queens, most of whom will die before the day is over. If you survive that, you will land somewhere alone, rip your own wings off with your legs, and then seal yourself underground in a tiny dirt chamber where you will starve for weeks while trying to build an entire colony from scratch with nothing but your own body fat and the eggs your exhausted abdomen keeps producing. If the colony doesn't get established fast enough, you die. If another queen establishes nearby, you might die. If a bird finds you during your flight, you die. If a worker from an established colony decides you're a threat, you absolutely die. And if you somehow survive all of that, your reward is spending the rest of your extremely long life, potentially decades, sealed inside a chamber underground, laying eggs. Constantly, without stopping, without leaving, without ever seeing sunlight again. That is the life of a fire ant queen. And the word miserable in the title is doing enormous amounts of heavy lifting, because the reality is substantially worse than that word implies. Welcome to one of the most brutal existences in the insect world, wrapped in the aesthetic of royalty and the reality of a biological prison sentence. Fire ants. Solenopsis invicta, specifically, which is the red imported fire ant, and the species responsible for most of what humans know and fear about this group. Originally from South America, Brazil, Argentina, the wetlands and grasslands of the continent's interior. They have since colonized vast swaths of the southern United States, Australia, China, Taiwan, and other regions where the climate allows their particular brand of biological chaos to unfold. They are invasive. They are aggressive. Their sting delivers a venom that causes a burning sensation so distinctive that the name fire ant is not metaphor. It is description. People have died from fire ant stings, primarily through allergic reactions to the alkaloid venom called solenopsin. They are also, and this cannot be overstated, extraordinarily successful. By almost every ecological metric, fire ants are winning. They displace native species, alter soil chemistry, affect agricultural systems, and have established themselves so thoroughly in their invaded territories that eradication efforts spanning decades have produced limited results. These are not fragile animals teetering on the edge of survival. These are conquerors, and at the center of every single fire ant colony responsible for its existence and its continuation is the queen, the figure around whom everything organizes, the individual whose biology makes the whole enterprise possible, who is also, if you think about it for more than 30 seconds, living through something that would be considered cruel if it were happening to anything larger. Here's where the story actually begins. Because to understand why being a fire ant queen is such a catastrophic proposition, you have to start before she becomes a queen. You have to start with what she is before that. Fire ants, like all ants, are eusocial insects operating under a caste system determined by a combination of genetics and development. In a fire ant colony, the vast majority of individuals are workers, sterile females who handle foraging, building, defense, and brood care. There are also male ants, called drones, whose existence is so tragically purpose-limited that they make the queen's life look balanced by comparison. But we'll get to them. And then there are the elates, the winged reproductive individuals, both female and male, who are produced when a colony is mature and conditions are right. The female elates are the future queens, born with wings, born with the capacity to reproduce, born, in other words, with the full biological potential to become the center of a new civilization. They are the chosen, the select. The ones the colony has invested enormous resources into producing because producing a winged reproductive ant is expensive. She's larger, she carries more fat reserves, she has flight muscles that demand significant nutritional investment to develop. Everything about a female elate says this individual matters. Then comes the nuptial flight, which is where the whole royalty narrative starts falling apart. The nuptial flight is triggered by specific environmental conditions, typically warm temperatures, high humidity, calm winds, often following rain. When conditions align, elates from multiple colonies in an area take to the air simultaneously. This synchrony is important because the whole point is mating with individuals from other colonies, not your siblings. The result, when it works, is a sky full of flying ants, hundreds of thousands of them, from dozens of colonies all airborne at the same time. This looks, from a human perspective, like an event of extraordinary biological drama. And it is. But it is also a massacre. Birds figure out very quickly when nuptial flights are happening. Frogs, toads, lizards, spiders. Every predator that can reach airborne or freshly landed insects treats nuptial flight days like an all-you-can-eat situation, because that's exactly what it is. The sheer number of flying ants is not abundance for the ants. It's the statistical mechanism by which the species ensures that at least some individuals survive despite the overwhelming predation pressure. You're not flying in a swarm because there's safety in numbers. You're flying in a swarm because the species can only afford for a tiny fraction of you to make it, and producing a massive surplus is the only reliable way to guarantee that fraction exists. Most female elates die on nuptial flight day. Most of them. The exact proportion varies by conditions and location, but the survivorship rate from female elate to established queen is extraordinarily low. You were one of thousands. The number who will become functioning queens is a small fraction of that thousand. Everything from weather to predators to the simple bad luck of landing in unsuitable habitat reduces the pool continuously. But suppose you make it. Suppose you're one of the survivors. You've mated during the flight, you've received sperm from one or more males, which you will store in a specialized organ called the spermatheca, and which you will use to fertilize eggs for the rest of your life. The males, incidentally, die after mating. Their entire existence culminates in this single act. They don't eat as adults. They live for a few days at most. The sperm they carry is their entire biological legacy, and once transferred, they are done. If that sounds harsh, remember that their alternative was to not exist at all, so there's a certain philosophical framework where it works out. You, though, are just getting started. You land somewhere. The criteria for somewhere are imprecise. You're looking for soil type, moisture levels, sun exposure, a dozen variables that your nervous system is attempting to evaluate with equipment that fits inside a head smaller than a pinhead. You might land in a great spot. You might land somewhere that will kill you in a week. You don't know yet. You're an ant. You're doing your best. And then you do something that is, even in the context of all the other things we've discussed, particularly striking. You reach back with your legs and you remove your own wings. Not because something is wrong, because this is the plan. The flight is over, the wings are no longer useful, and the flight muscles that powered them are now going to be metabolized, consumed from the inside, to provide energy during the founding phase. You are literally eating yourself to survive. The deautonomization, the self-removal of wings, marks a point of no return. A wingless queen cannot rejoin a nuptial flight. She cannot relocate far if the founding site turns out to be unsuitable. She has committed to this location, this attempt, with her entire existence. She digs. With her mandibles and legs, she excavates a small chamber, just big enough. She seals the entrance. And then, inside that chamber, completely alone, sealed in darkness, with no food source except her own body, she begins to lay eggs. This phase, called claustral colony founding, is one of the more quietly extraordinary things happening in any ecosystem at any given time. The queen is not just surviving. She's building, Her fat reserves, her resorbing flight muscles, her own physiological infrastructure, all of it is being converted into the first generation of workers who will, if everything works, be the foundation of the colony. The first eggs hatch into larvae. The queen feeds them. With what? By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. With trophic eggs, unfertilized eggs produced specifically as nutrition, and with secretions from her own body. She is manufacturing food from herself. The larvae develop pupate and emerge as the first workers. These first workers are small, smaller than workers produced later in the colony's life because resources were scarce during their development. They're called nantics, and they are underweight, underpowered, and absolutely critical. The nantics dig open the chamber entrance. They begin foraging. They bring back food. And for the first time since the founding began, the queen can eat something that isn't herself. If you make it to this point, weeks of isolation, self-cannibalization, and egg production, you are now technically a founding queen with a functional colony beginning to take shape. The hard part is over, except the hard part is not over, because now begins a different kind of difficulty, one that's less acute and more chronic, and in some ways more psychologically awful to contemplate than the founding phase. Though it should be noted that fire ants do not have psychology in any meaningful human sense, so the psychologically awful framing is entirely a human projection onto a creature that experiences its existence through mechanisms we don't fully understand. But we're going to keep projecting, because this is a video, and human beings understand things through narrative. The queen's life, once the colony is established, contracts to a single function: reproduction. She lays eggs, constantly. A mature fire ant queen can produce somewhere between 1,500 and 5,000 eggs per day. That number, held up against the scale of a single organism's body, is staggering. She is not occasionally reproductive. She is a continuous biological production facility optimized by evolution to convert nutrition into offspring with extraordinary efficiency. She does not leave the colony. Ever. After that initial dispersal flight and the founding period, a fire ant queen does not go outside. She doesn't forage. She doesn't explore. She doesn't see sunlight. Workers bring her food, groom her, remove her eggs as she produces them, regulate the temperature and humidity of her chamber, and manage everything about the external world on her behalf. She exists in a maintained environment, fed and tended, completely insulated from any direct experience of the world she's responsible for populating. This is usually where the royal metaphor gets applied most enthusiastically. She is served. She is tended. She is central. But consider what central means in this context. The queen is not powerful in any decision-making sense. She doesn't issue orders. She doesn't direct foraging routes or determine defense strategies. The colony's behavior is distributed. It emerges from the collective actions of thousands of workers responding to chemical signals, most of which the queen herself produces. She is the source of pheromones that regulate worker behavior, that signal her health and reproductive status, that maintain colony cohesion. Her chemical output is the heartbeat of the colony, but that means she is less a ruler and more a broadcasting station. Her power is real, but it's chemical, not cognitive. She doesn't decide anything in the way the word queen implies. She produces signals. The colony responds to signals. The system runs, and she does this for years, potentially decades. The lifespan of a fire ant queen, when she survives and maintains a healthy colony, can reach 6 or 7 years, sometimes longer. 6 or 7 years of continuous egg production, underground, fed by workers, never leaving, generating pheromones and offspring in a dark chamber that represents the totality of her experienced world. Now, layer on top of this the complications that arise within the social structure itself, because the queen's position is not as secure as the queen label suggests. In some fire ant colonies, specifically in what researchers call polygyne colonies, as opposed to monogyne single queen colonies, multiple queens coexist. This situation arises more commonly in the invasive range of the red imported fire ant than in its native South American habitat, and it creates a social dynamic that is genuinely strange. Multiple egg-laying queens in a single colony means resources are shared, reproductive output per queen is lower, and the colony's identity and cohesion become more diffuse. But here's the sharper edge. In polygyny colonies, workers sometimes execute queens. This is not metaphor. Workers will attack and kill queens, particularly queens whose pheromone profiles signal declining health or reduced reproductive output. The colony will not maintain a queen who isn't producing a value. When a queen's fertility declines, when she gets too old, when her chemical signals start to drift from the profile that workers interpret as healthy, productive queen, she becomes a liability. And colonies do not carry liabilities. The workers who tend the queen so carefully, who bring her food and groom her and maintain her chamber, those same workers are capable of killing her the moment her signal profile drops below acceptable thresholds. It is the most clinical form of evaluation imaginable. No sentiment, no loyalty in any meaningful sense, just biochemical assessment with lethal consequences for poor performance. A fire ant queen is not beloved. She is useful. Those are very different things. There's another threat that comes from outside the colony, one that adds a horror movie layer to the already grim picture. Parasitoid flies, specifically Pseudactyon species, often called phorid flies, are natural enemies of fire ants that target workers in the field. A phorid fly will hover over a fire ant, dart in, and inject an egg into the ant's body. The larva hatches and migrates to the ant's head, where it develops by consuming the ant's internal tissues, eventually causing the head to detach. The ant is, for a period, essentially a living incubator for something that is eating it from the inside. This parasitism is primarily a worker issue, not a direct queen issue. But it affects colony dynamics, stresses the workforce, and represents the broader ecological reality within which fire ant colonies operate. The world is trying, constantly and from multiple directions, to dismantle what the queen spent her founding phase building. Every queen who successfully establishes a colony is maintaining it against continuous biological opposition. Let's return briefly to the genetic dimension of this, because the queen's relationship to her own offspring is weirder than it appears on the surface. In any ant colony, the queen is genetically related to her workers, but the degree of that relatedness is complicated by the fact that she typically mates with multiple males during the nuptial flight and stores sperm from all of them. This means workers in the same colony may be daughters of different fathers, making them half-sisters rather than full sisters. The genetic unity of the colony is real, but not absolute. This has implications for the evolutionary dynamics of colony behavior, and for the circumstances under which workers might or might not support the queen's reproductive interests over time. The workers, meanwhile, are sterile in normal circumstances. They cannot lay fertilized eggs. They can lay unfertilized eggs that would develop into males, but the queen produces pheromones that suppress worker reproduction. So the worker's genetic legacy runs exclusively through the queen's offspring, which means supporting the queen is, from a gene's eye view, in the worker's best evolutionary interest. But that support is entirely conditional on the queen continuing to produce eggs efficiently. The moment that calculus shifts, the support evaporates. Evolution has no room for sentiment. Every relationship in a fire ant colony is transactional at its foundation, even when it looks, on the surface, like devotion. Here's something that gets lost in most coverage of fire ant queens: the experience of founding failure, which is the most common outcome. The vast majority of queens who survive the nuptial flight and begin the founding phase do not successfully establish colonies. They die during claustral founding, ran out of fat reserves before the first workers emerged, picked a site with unsuitable soil, were discovered and killed by workers from an established nearby colony, were found by a predator, experienced a flooding event that destroyed the nascent chamber. The whole elaborate architecture of the queen's life, the investment in wings and flight muscles, the nuptial flight, the mating, the wing removal, the weeks of self-starvation underground, All of it can terminate in a failed founding attempt that leaves no trace in the world except a small dead ant in a small dirt chamber. The species absorbs this at the population level. Producing excess queens is how fire ants ensure that some queens succeed. But from the perspective of any individual queen who fails, the calculus is simply brutal. She gave everything the biology had to give, and it wasn't enough. The system used her, and she didn't make the cut. This is the part where, if you're the type of person who anthropomorphizes insects, and let's be honest, you're watching a video about fire ant queens, so you probably are, the whole enterprise starts to feel almost unbearably bleak. Not because fire ants suffer in any way we can confirm, not because there's anything morally wrong with how insect societies operate, but because when you lay out the complete arc of a fire ant queen's existence from beginning to end, the gap between the title and the reality is so enormous that miserable really does undersell it. She is born with wings and a biological mandate. She survives a gauntlet most of her kind don't. She tears off her own wings and seals herself underground. She starves for weeks while manufacturing the first citizens of her civilization from her own body. She spends decades underground laying thousands of eggs a day, maintaining the pheromone signature that holds her colony together, while being evaluated continuously by the very workers she created and remaining exactly one bad biochemical signal away from being executed by her own children. And she does all of this not because she chose it, not because she was offered an alternative and found it wanting, but because evolution wrote this particular script 400 million years before she existed, and she is following it with the blind precision of something that has never had an option to do otherwise. The title says miserable. The reality says the word miserable was invented by creatures who have the cognitive apparatus to recognize misery, and it's not entirely clear whether that makes the fire ant queen's situation better or worse. There is buried in all of this something that functions like a mirror. Fire ant queens build civilizations from nothing through extraordinary physiological sacrifice, and then spend the rest of their existence as the engine of an operation that runs on their output but doesn't particularly care about them as individuals. The colony needs a queen. It does not need this queen. The moment productivity declines, replacement begins. The system is not cruel. It simply has no architecture for anything other than function. Every element of the queen's existence, her biology, her social role, her relationship with the workers she produces, her vulnerability to execution, her confinement, her reproductive labor, all of it resolves into a single principle. She is the means, not the end. The colony is the end. She is what makes the colony possible, and making something possible in the fire ant world is the entirety of what you are permitted to be. That's the answer to the title's question. Being born a fire ant queen is miserable because every phase of the role is more demanding, more constrained, and more dangerous than the word queen implies. The founding gauntlet, the self-consumption, the confinement, the constant production, the conditional loyalty, the terminal evaluation, the statistical likelihood of failure at every stage, and underneath all of it, the quiet biological truth that the most powerful individual in an entire civilization is also, in a meaningful sense, the most trapped. Royalty has always been a cage with better furniture. In the fire ant world, they skipped the furniture.